So I really can't bear the double standards.
JD Vance
I can conclude them all. I think it's an outrageous example of sort of double standards, clearly responsible for making the country more divisive, divided, poorer, less relevant in the world, fewer opportunities for our kids and grandkids. I think Brexit is just proving to be the most extraordinary act of self-harm. No one should look to these figures in Silicon Valley to make their big, difficult, ethical and moral adjudications in the trade-offs about society. That's what politicians are there for. I'd been there in the company during the Trump 1 administration, and as you said, I was the sort of principal decision maker on suspending Donald Trump from Facebook services for, I think, 2 years in the end. But it was more just a feeling that I'd come to the company at a completely different time, back in 2018. I made a number of changes, of which I'm very sort of proud, which I think were necessary. I was always the first person to say, look, I just think there should be a distance, really, respectful, but nonetheless a distance between these big private sector centres of power and political power. And of course, that's different. It's not just Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, the whole of Silicon Valley, as you say. You saw it in picture form at that inauguration, decided to throw their lot very overtly in with the new political masters in DC. Yeah, and I thought at that point, doesn't really appeal to my skill set. What I didn't know, honestly, at that time was there was this very big zeitgeist shift, obviously led by Elon Musk, to really just become totally partisan. And it's just not what I personally think is right in the long run. I also don't actually believe it's sustainable either, because guess what? As you know, as a veteran political editor and correspondent, the pendulum always swings. And so my view is, in the long run, these are young companies. Still, they're big, but they're young companies, certainly companies like Meta. I think in the long run, these companies will need to learn to plot their own sort of steady-ish course rather than constantly sort of flip-flop from one side to the other, depending on the change in the political weather. And so I just felt, I'd done a bunch of things. I'd been there actually longer than I'd originally anticipated. So it felt like a natural time to move on.
And presumably, in terms of how you should deal with Donald Trump, do you think your old friend Ed Davies got it right? He's going to be boycotting the state dinner with President Trump.
Oh, okay. I think it is important, whether you boycott or not, I think it is important that there are clear voices in British politics saying, look, this administration is doing immense damage to a long established transatlantic partnership. The views that they espouse are based on very, very different values. It's an extremely belligerent America First approach to things. And I think it's totally natural that it should fall on Ed Davey, if no one else is going to do it, to say, well, hang on a minute, I don't want to go along with this kind of stuff. And by the way, we're talking today, I think, on the day when Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi and others are meeting in Beijing. I believe it's today, or at least this week. If there's any demonstration of how wrong-headed the Trump administration's approach to geopolitics is that, I think it's worth just underlining what a spectacular own goal it is for this new American administration to more or less have chased a partner as important as the Prime Minister of India, the world's largest democracy, into the hands of the world's largest autocracy, China. It's a spectacular failure of statecraft, and so I think it's important in our own domestic political debate in the UK, of which of course I'm no longer a part, that people speak clearly about what the US administration is doing, because the government, by choice or by force of circumstance, is much more sort of mealy-mouthed about it.
And in terms of sort of speaking your voice to the US administration, I'm taking it that JD Vance didn't invite you to his Cotswolds cottage.
Didn't get the invitation to the Cotswolds, no.
But if he had done that, hasn't he got a point on restrictions on free speech in this country? You think of all those police investigations into non-crime hate incidents.
So I feel very torn on this one, because on the one hand, I cannot stand the rank hypocrisy of senior American politicians from the right flying first class or by private jet over to the United Kingdom and declaring that somehow there is excessive censorship in the UK, and then flying back to the US to basically intimidate and bully and cow their own opponents in a way which I think is flagrantly contrary to American principles of free expression. So I really can't bear the double standards.
JD Vance
I can conclude them all. I think it's an outrageous example of sort of double standards. Having said all of that, I think I saw in the report, maybe it was in The Economist recently, that the police are now arresting 30 people a day for online speech offences, many of those arrests taking place based on powers which even, from the statute book that even preceded the existence of the internet. I do worry that we're maybe getting the balance wrong in this country in the following way. Firstly, that maybe we are being over-censorious to speech that is offensive, unpleasant, vile. But, guess what? Part of the definitions of living in a free society is that you can say things that are offensive and that other people violently disagree with, whilst at the same time, oddly enough, not going far enough, in my view, on protecting children by implementing properly, workable, watertight age verification requirements. On my own view, and I consistently said this to ministers in this government and previous governments, I think the Online Safety Act was a missed opportunity to implement a much, much tougher requirement on age verification on the tech industry than has been the case. And so I think in an odd kind of way, we're probably overdoing it on kind of being censorious for speech that may be dreadful speech, but speech that you probably still think should circulate in a free democratic society, whilst not being tough enough on really putting in place proper age verification protocols.
We're going to come to age verification in a minute. Before we do that, I mentioned about Mark Zuckerberg, your former boss, at the inauguration ceremony in January. He's quite a mysterious figure. What is Mark Zuckerberg like?
I mean, he's an engineer and a businessman. I mean, he's not a politician, not a political philosopher. No one should look to these figures in Silicon Valley to make their big, difficult, ethical and moral adjudications in the trade-offs about society. That's what politicians are there for. That's what governments are there for. I mean, look, is he perfect? No. It's like nobody is. Does he have his weaknesses and flaws? You bet. Has he made mistakes? Yeah, sure. But I think the way to think about him is as a highly competitive engineer.
Now, there's a big debate in this country, across the world, about online safety for teenagers. Why is there no mention in your book of Molly Russell?
I think there is mention.
There's mention of the impact on teenagers, and there's impact of what you did, but there's no mention of Molly Russell, who, of course, took her life after viewing self-harm images on Instagram, and the coroner said that she died while suffering from depression and the negative effects on online content. So in the book you talk about the issue, but you don't talk about her. That's a huge case in this country.
Yes, it is a huge case, and of course the book is a much broader book. It's not just about one incident, however heart-wrenching and tragic. I try in the book, but people need to read it and decide for themselves whether they think I've done this fairly or not. So what I try and do is, as dispassionately as possible, just look at what the evidence is, what the data is. There's a growing body of academic evidence, which itself is really very divided. And my own conclusion is, even though the evidence is very divided about whether social media is good or bad, we all remember how useful actually online services and apps and services were during the COVID pandemic. There's clear evidence for many, many young people, actually social media, particularly if they interact with others, is a great way for them to develop their own identity and interests and so on and so forth. Clearly there's a dark side as well. Where I come out is, look, it doesn't matter whether what the researchers say in their claim and counterclaim. In the end, this is exactly the kind of decision that should be taken out of the hands of the tech companies and should be in the hands of democratic politicians. So if this country or any other country decides, I don't know, there should be no social media use for age 16 below, or no phones in schools, I think that's exactly what governments and parliaments are there for. The only thing I, in a sense, have a little bit of insight into is then, if that's your intention, how do you do it?
Now, here you are, back in the UK. How are you enjoying life in Brexit Britain?
I love Britain. I'm very, as the Americans, I'm a great patriot. I think Brexit is just proving to be the most extraordinary act of self-harm. I can hardly think of anything that has done more almost willful self-harm to a country than Brexit. Not just the decision itself taken on this wafer-thin majority, but then this ludicrous way in which those sort of pantomime series of Conservative governments just ratcheted up and up and up, and it turned Brexit into a harder and harder and harder Brexit, which has become self-evidently self-harming. And of course, just seems extraordinary to me that the man whose genius idea it was, Nigel Farage, now seems to be, in such a moment of pomp in British politics. He seems to be never held to account for the fact that he, as much as almost anybody else, is clearly responsible for making the country more divisive, divided, poorer, less relevant in the world, fewer opportunities for our kids and grandkids.
Sir Nick Clegg, thank you for talking to our Newsnight audience.
Thank you.